So what is fake news? It's a term that's actually been around for a long time, but it has been used much more popularly and vernacularly for the last about 4.5 years. And it's come to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. One of the things you could say is that fake news is getting the facts wrong. So this does happen sometimes, that news organizations get the facts wrong. And in fact, it happened just a couple of days ago. And here's a headline just from yesterday about the Washington Post being fooled by a fake FBI raid, right? So the Washington Post reported that there was an FBI raid, and there in fact was not. It was a hoax, and they reported that anyway. So getting the facts wrong does happen sometimes. When it does, it's very embarrassing for news organizations. And any of you who have been or will be in one of my journalism classes, the thing I will tell you is, if you take one thing away from any class with me, it would be you have to get the facts right every single time. It is the most important thing that we do as journalists. And that's because it is a contract that we have with our readers. They give us their money and they give us their attention in return for us giving them the truth. But it also is because if we do a bad job of getting the facts correct, then we can actually cause harm. We can cause harm to our sources themselves, and we can also cause harm to society. So getting things right is really important to journalists. Sometimes when they say fake news, they're implying that journalists have gotten the facts wrong, when really what is happening is that the journalists are reporting things that the person being reported on doesn't like or doesn't agree with. So they call it fake news. Is fake news just making stuff up? Because that's another implication that we have for that. And I'm going to say, maybe. It depends on what you call news. Real journalists, so journalists who work for real journalism outlets, will follow a set of ethical rules. It's shocking to people sometimes that journalists do actually have ethics, but there is an entire code of ethics that people are taught when they go to journalism school, and that the field holds itself to a standard to try to follow when they're working. And I realize this is too small for you to see on the screens that you're watching it on. It is the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. It is the first thing that comes up if you Google journalism and code of ethics. And I'm sure they would love it if you wanted to read that. So real journalists follow those ethical rules. It's one of those things that we have to sell to the public, or that we have available to sell to them, that we have these standards and practices of the field, and we follow those standards and practices. So when you get something from real news as opposed to fake news, you know what it is that you're getting. You know how it is created. But we have a problem. How do you know what is real? How do we know that this site is correct news and this site is fake news? You can actually get newsprint delivered to your house with news on it that is at least highly biased, if not sometimes fake. How do you know what is real? This problem comes from the fact that news has been deconstructed. So it used to be that your news would come to you in these big chunks. So it would either be dead trees that were delivered to your doorstep that were all created by a single news organization, and it would come every day in the morning or the afternoon, and it would have the news in it. Or maybe it would be a particular time period where you would listen on the radio or you would watch on TV, and you knew the organization and all of the news came together in something that very specifically looked like news. Well, now news is deconstructed, and we know from studies that many people actually get their news from this, from their phones or from their computers. And when that happens, particular news stories are sometimes taken down from, maybe a 800-word news story to a 240-character tweet. And then they are passed along from person to person, and all of the context around that story gets taken away. So everything ends up looking kind of the same. It all looks like facts, but you don't really know where they came from or where the facts came from. So while it used to be really helpful, and it's still a little bit helpful, to look for particular news organizations that are known for sharing real news, we find that legacy media outlets, so that would be like your News and Observer or your New York Times or your NBC News, have been joined by other things that are online only, like your BuzzFeeds and your Voxes and your Vice News and many things that have the word news in their title, and are they really news or not? So it can be helpful to try to look at those particular sources. But for people who really want to be smart consumers of news and also smart spreaders of news, as you find interesting things and you reshare them on social media, we need to move from fact checking, which is what I talked about before, to sense checking. So in part, thinking about, you know, the factual matters of things, but also thinking about the things that happen and if they actually make sense. And as I was starting to think about that, I realized that there's a particular kind of teaching that we don't really do in our journalism programs that we probably should, because it's a mistake that media makes a lot. Public figures, when they want to make particular points or when they want to get out of asking hard questions, will sometimes use language in a very deceptive way. So it seems like they're saying one thing, and you may actually write down that they're saying this thing, and it seems like there's logic and reasoning behind it, but the logic and the reasoning just don't hold up. And so reporters, as they're gathering information, need to be able to listen and to think about what it is that's actually being said and if it makes sense. And all of us, as we are sharing that information, also need to be thinking about that as well. Is what's being said holding up? One thing I want to point out, I'm going to go through some examples with you, is that this deceptive use of wording and information, it happens a lot, and it happens on all sides of the political spectrum. So you should not take this talk as being any sort of attack on any particular ideology, whether you are of a liberal persuasion or a conservative persuasion. We can find examples on all sides that do that. And in fact, when I wrote the book, I have an exactly equal number of examples from all different ideologies in there. Okay, so let's go through some examples. The first one I want to talk about is poisoning the well. So poisoning the well is when someone tells you up front that the information that you might get later, the source that is giving you is bad. So you're not going to believe what the source tells you. If you think about the fable of the little boy who cried wolf, he sort of poisoned his own well, right? Everybody just didn't believe that he was going to tell the truth because he had lied a bunch of times. When someone does this for someone else, that's poisoning the well. And so I put an example here from Sean Hannity, who is a host of a radio opinion show and an opinion show on the Fox News cable channel. And he has a habit of referring to the media as the media mob. The media mob is roughly a synonym for the way fake news is used a lot of times. And so he's talking about Joe Biden and saying that Joe Biden did something and there was no outrage from the media mob. He gets a pass. Predictably, they do this often. When you call the media fake news, or you call them the media mob, what you are doing is teaching your audience that this is not a reliable source. And then when they say something later, you're not going to believe them because you've learned that they're not a reliable source. That's poisoning the well. Another one is a straw man argument. Straw man arguments are extremely common in political debates. You're basically saying that your opponent is saying one thing when that's not actually what they're saying. So you're taking something maybe that they said and you're twisting it to something that you can more easily refute. So here's an example from President Bill Clinton. He said, "Oh, there are people who say, oh, Mr. President, I am for a strong America. I just don't understand why you fool with the UN." This is a straw man argument because there are not these other people, right? So he's just set up this sort of fake group of other people who might say this quote, but they don't really exist. It's easy for him then to go on and say, well, here's why I fool with the UN. You know, these people who don't exist, their argument is wrong. Up next, we have the appeal to hypocrisy. The appeal to hypocrisy is where you say, you're trying to say that the bad thing that I'm doing isn't worth us worrying about because look over there, somebody else did a different bad thing. This would be like if you had two kids in your house and one kid was saying, oh, you know, this kid came in late last night, get him in trouble, mom. And the kid who came in late is saying, yeah, well, this kid stole money from your purse, right? They both did bad things. Two things can both be bad at the same time. But when you appeal to hypocrisy, you try to make it so people don't know. Here is a quotation from earlier this year from Charles Schumer, who is the Senate Minority Leader, and he is talking about the Senate Majority Leader, and when they were getting ready to have the impeachment trial, many Republicans were saying that the Democrats were being hypocrites because when Bill Clinton was on trial for impeachment, the Democrats said, oh, this is a terrible partisan process. So Schumer is saying, Leader McConnell claimed the impeachment was motivated by partisan rage. This from the man who said proudly, I am not impartial. I have no intention of being impartial. What hypocrisy. A lack of partiality on either side is bad. They can both be bad at the same time. Calling someone a hypocrite doesn't mean that you're not yourself wrong. All right, a slippery slope argument. A slippery slope argument is assuming that a chain of events is inevitable. And for those of you who are students, if your parents read If You Give a Mouse a Cookie to you when you were a child, that is an argument you should be well familiar with. If not, you may have heard or even thought to yourself, I did poorly on that quiz. I did poorly on that quiz, which means I'm going to do badly in the class. And if I do badly in the class, I'm going to fail it. And if I fail that class, I'm not going to complete my major. And if I don't complete my major, I'm never going to graduate and I'm going to be homeless. That is a slippery slope when you have that. The example I gave for this one is not a political one, but it's a Star Wars one. That fear leads to anger, leads to hate, leads to suffering, and eventually takes you to the dark side. But maybe you could just be afraid and not get all the way to the dark side. That chain of events is not proven. The hasty generalization. The hasty generalization is when you're drawing a big conclusion without having enough data to support it. So for example, let's say you do a study abroad in France and you go to a restaurant in Paris and the waiter is kind of rude to you. And you come back and tell everyone, oh, all French people hate Americans. Just because one waiter was rude to you in one city in France does not mean that all French people hate Americans. You can't draw that conclusion. And the picture that I have here is a picture of a senator from Oklahoma who was making an argument against climate change. And his argument against climate change was that on the day that he was making the argument, it was snowing in Washington, D.C. So he actually had an aide go outside of the building and gather up some snow and bring in a snowball that he showed to indicate that because it was cold outside in Washington on this one day, climate change does not exist. A hasty generalization. All right, an appeal to purity. An appeal to purity is saying that all real examples of a particular thing think in a particular way. You see this sometimes in adjectives that are applied to people, for example, being ladylike. Only ladies would only do these things and they would not do these other things. You also see it in politics, often with appeals to patriotism. Real Americans, real patriots will stand for the flag, will sing the national anthem, will have a barbecue on Labor Day, who knows? But lots of different things that people will say, you know, in order to be a member of this group, then you must think in this particular way. And so my example from this is from Senator Bernie Sanders, who was talking about Hillary Clinton when she was running against him in the primary and said, you can't be a moderate and a progressive. Basically saying you can't be progressive if you're a moderate is really what he meant. All right, equivocation. Equivocation is when you take a word that has two meanings and you let the listener assume that you mean one meaning when you actually mean the other. And there are lots of examples of words that do this. Faith is one that's used commonly, but I think this example here is really good. So here we have US President George W. Bush, and he was the president during September 11th, which we just had the anniversary of this week. And so he was talking about the practice of waterboarding. And so waterboarding is a practice where you take somebody and you attach them to a board and you pour a large amount of water on them so that they feel like they're drowning. And it causes them to panic and they're more likely to talk to you. Most of the world considered waterboarding to be a torture technique. And so George W. Bush was giving a speech and said, I want to be absolutely clear with the people of the world, the United States does not torture. What he was referring to in this case was a definition of what torture is that was written in an internal document to the United States. So even though he's talking to the people of the world who would define waterboarding as torture, he is saying it's not torture because it's something that just exists in this one place. So that's equivocation. An appeal to popularity. An appeal to popularity is acting as if something must be correct because a lot of people think that it is correct. So for example, President Trump was talking about border crossings being reduced. And he says, many people are saying it's because nobody wants to come to the US anymore. And I only have 3 miles of new wall. So he's implying that the imminent border wall and his immigration policies are the reason nobody wants to come to the US anymore. So border crossings are down because people are so afraid of what's going to happen for them. He doesn't have evidence for that, right? So the evidence that he's giving is that many people are saying this, but many people think a lot of things that later turn out to not be true. I think an example of that might be when you guys were babies, your parents might have been told by your grandparents to put you to sleep on your stomach. Because at the time that I was a baby, you put babies to sleep on their stomach because they do sleep better when you do that. About the time that you guys were babies, they figured out that sleeping on your stomach caused some babies to die of sudden infant death syndrome. And so the advice was to put your baby to sleep on their back. The popular wisdom was put them on their stomach, and then evidence came in and changed that. But, you know, things change sometimes. Appeals to popularity are sometimes appeals to the wisdom of the crowd that no longer applies. All right, and one bonus one, which is ignoring the base rate. There's a whole section in the book on numerical errors, and I'm not going to go through all of those, but ignoring the base rate, I think, is one that's worth mentioning because it's being used a lot in the arguments right now around coronavirus. Ignoring the base rate is making a bad conclusion because you took the numbers out of their proper context. So for example, at the time that I got married, which was a while ago because I just celebrated my 30th anniversary, it was common wisdom and commonly told to people who were getting married that 50% of marriages end in divorce. So people who did premarital counseling would use this statistic, and divorce lawyers would use this statistic, and all kinds of things to make you afraid that, like, this marriage that I have right now, there's a 50-50 chance that we're going to split up. It's not actually true, though. It turns out that there are some people who get married several times and get divorced several times, and divorce kind of leads to divorce. There's a sort of type of person who has that kind of marriage. But for most people who get married for the first time, they don't have that. They tend to stay together a lot longer. So you're ignoring what you're dealing from, right? Are you dealing from all people, which this is suggesting, or are you dealing from a particular group of people who are more likely to get divorced? Now it is your turn. So we're going to play a game of Spot the Deception. And so I've got several examples for you from fairly recent media, and I'd love it if you could vote on what you think the deception is. And let's look at some deceptions. Okay, this is Senator Tom Cotton. He's a senator from Arkansas, and he's talking about cancel culture. So he says, what is the end of cancel culture? I will tell you what it is. It's right here in this city, Washington, the District of Columbia. This is where it will end if we don't put an end to the madness now. Just up the mall is the Washington Monument. Are we going to tear the Washington Monument down? Are we going to rename it the Obelisk of Wokeness? What's the deception there? Go ahead and type your guesses in the chat. All right, got lots of votes for the slippery slope. Anyone want to vote for anything else? Got to vote in favor of the Obelisk of Wokeness. Yeah, all right, well, you've all got that. Yes, it is a slippery slope type of argument that he was making an argument that people are protesting and some statues in some cities were torn down and it was going to result in the end of everything. Didn't end up happening. Here we go. Here's the next one. Let's slow down a little bit. So this was actually a public service campaign that was done to encourage people not to use meth. What is the rhetorical issue here? It's not slippery slope. I'll give you a hint. Anyone else want to guess? You guys can be brave. It's okay. All right, I'll call it. It is equivocation. So they're using on it in a couple of different ways. So on it meaning I'm on top of it, I've planned for it, something like that. Or on it meaning I am a meth user. It was actually really funny when this one came out. And so it came out, I think it was South Dakota, but like a few days after it came out and everybody was making fun of it, they actually said, oh, we meant to do that because it got a lot more traction that way to do that. And it was like, sure, Jan, but we'll see. Maybe it was. Okay, let's go to the next one. Oh, this is a video clue. So, and I'm hoping this will work. If you can't hear me, like somebody type something in the chat and yell at me for that, but I think this will work. So what is the deceptive issue here? What is she doing?
Of course, for one pesky yam that just wouldn't grow. That had to weigh on your soul, didn't it, Todd?
Maybe a little.
A little? A big orange splotch on your perfect record? I bet that pissed you right off, didn't it? Is that why you hit your wife? Withdrawn? Is that why you drink and pop pills? Withdrawn? Are you a virgin? Withdrawn? Did you?
All right. So what was she doing? Yeah, you got it. She's poisoning the well. She's making Todd seem like a very unreliable witness by suggesting all of these things, even though she's later saying, oh, just kidding, it's not true. It still kind of gives people the idea, well, why would someone say stuff like this if it wasn't actually true? All right. I have a couple college-related ones for you guys. So these are both from Twitter, I think. We can riot, loot, and burn in person, but not attend class. We can celebrate living in highly unsanitary conditions in 6 blocks in Seattle, but not attend class. It can't be one, but what, not the other. That's right, that is an appeal to hypocrisy, saying that, and this is an interesting one because they're really dealing from a kind of a deceptive place, because what they're talking about is we're just gathering, right? So if we can gather to do this, then we can gather to do this. But really, remember, with the appeal to hypocrisy, 2 things can be bad at the same time. So, you know, they're using inflammatory language about protesting, but protesting from a coronavirus perspective, like from a disease spreading perspective, could also be bad, right? It could be bad in both cases to gather groups of people together in that case. All right. Millions of people are still going to work every day, many of whom aren't able to protect themselves as well as a professor can. Don't hear them complain or get scared nearly as much as I have heard some college teachers worry. I actually, since I was having trouble with the slides, I think I skipped one about this one. So I'm just going to tell you that this one is an appeal to ignorance. An appeal to ignorance is where you are saying that because you don't have evidence that something is not true, it must be true. And we could say, Elon, I can't prove that Elon University was not built by aliens. Therefore, it must have been built by aliens. And that would sound pretty ridiculous, right? We had an example of this recently when the White House Chief of Staff was being interviewed on CNN about voter fraud. And he, the interviewer said, we don't have any evidence of voter fraud. And the White House Chief of Staff said, well, we don't have any evidence that there's not voter fraud either. As if it proved that there was something. So in this case, they're saying, well, I don't hear them complain or get scared. Just because you don't hear people going to work or scared doesn't mean that there aren't people going to work who are scared. It doesn't mean that there is either. It just means that there's no evidence in that case.